For a long time, the silence felt heavier than any answer ever could. Because when someone who has been at the center of everything chooses not to speak, it creates a space that begins to fill itself with questions. And those questions don't fade. They grow. They stretch into every part of the story, into every moment that doesn't quite make sense. And that's exactly what has been happening in the Nancy Guthrie case. A quiet tension building beneath the surface, driven not by what was said, but by what wasn't until now. Because something has changed, something that has shifted the direction of this entire case in a way no one expected. Savannah has finally spoken, and the moment she did, the structure of everything we thought we understood began to move, not collapse, but rearrange itself into something new. Something that demands a closer look, because when someone breaks their silence after holding it for so long, it's never random, it's never without reason. It happens because something has reached a point where it can no longer stay hidden. And that's what makes this moment so important, because it suggests that whatever Savannah chose to reveal carries weight, not just emotionally, but structurally within the case itself. And before we go deeper into what she said and why it matters so much, I want to take a moment to welcome you to the channel. We look for the truth in the shadows of cold cases and closed files. If you value this kind of deep dive investigation, please consider subscribing. And as we begin this journey together, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Whether you're joining us from the United States, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world, leave a comment below. It helps us remember that these stories, though local, touch hearts across the globe. And now, as we return to this moment, the focus becomes sharper, because Savannah's silence was never just absence. It was part of the case, part of the structure that shaped how everything was understood up to this point. And when that silence breaks, it doesn't just add information, it changes context. It reframes what came before, because now every detail that existed during that silence has to be reevaluated in light of what is being said now. And that's where the shift begins. Not in the words themselves, but in how those words interact with everything else. Because when new information enters a case like this, it doesn't exist on its own. It connects, it aligns, or it contradicts. And those connections are what investigators pay attention to, because they reveal whether something fits within the existing sequence or whether it challenges it. And that's what makes this so compelling, because early reactions suggest that what Savannah has said doesn't just fit, it redirects, it points toward areas that were previously overlooked, it highlights moments that didn't seem significant at the time, but now carry a different weight. And that's what turns a statement into a turning point. Not the fact that it exists, but the way it changes how everything else is seen. And that's exactly what is happening here. A re-examination of the case through a new lens, one shaped by someone who has been inside the story from the beginning, someone who has seen things from a perspective no investigator can fully replicate. And that perspective is what gives this moment its power, because it introduces something that wasn't available before, an internal viewpoint that can either confirm what was suspected or challenge it entirely. And as we begin to look closer at what Savannah revealed, something becomes clear almost immediately. The timing of her statement is just as important as the content, because timing in cases like this is never accidental. It reflects pressure, it reflects change, it reflects moments where something shifts enough to prompt action. And the fact that this silence has been broken now suggests that something within the case has reached a point where staying silent was no longer possible. And that alone raises questions, because it means that whatever Savannah has revealed is connected not just to the past, but to the present state of the investigation, and that connection is what gives it relevance. Because now it's not just a reflection, it's part of the current movement of the case, part of what is shaping where it goes next, and that's where the analysis begins. Not just of what was said, but of how it fits into the larger timeline. Because timelines are what hold everything together. They show how moments connect, how actions follow one another, and how sequences form. And when a new element is introduced, especially one as significant as this, it has to be placed within that timeline carefully, because where it fits determines what it means, And early indications suggest that what Savannah revealed aligns with certain gaps that have existed in the case for some time, gaps that were noticed but never fully understood. So any moments where something didn't quite add up but lacked the context to be explained. And now with this new perspective, those gaps are beginning to close. Not completely, but enough to suggest that they were never random. They were part of a sequence that is only now becoming visible, and that's what makes this so important, because it suggests that what we are seeing is not just new information, but a connection to something that has been there all along, something that required the right perspective to be understood. And that perspective may have just been introduced through Savannah's statement. And as we continue to follow this, as we continue to examine what was revealed and how it connects to everything else, the case begins to take on a new shape, one that feels more structured, more aligned, and more capable of leading to answers. Because once the pieces begin to connect, once the sequence starts to form, the path forward becomes clearer, not easy, but defined. And that definition is what investigators rely on because it allows them to focus their efforts, to follow the strongest connections, and to build a narrative that holds together under scrutiny. And that's what we are starting to see now, the early stages of that narrative forming around this new development, this moment where silence gave way to something that may have changed everything. And as we move deeper into what Savannah revealed, the details begin to surface. Not all at once, but gradually as each part of her statement is examined and placed within the larger context of the case. And one of the first things that stands out is not just what she said, but how it aligns with certain behaviors that were observed earlier, behaviors that didn't fully make sense at the time, but now appear to connect in a way that suggests intention. And intention is what investigators look for, because it reveals purpose, it explains actions, and it connects moments that might otherwise seem unrelated. And if what Savannah has revealed points toward intention, then it becomes one of the most significant developments in the entire case, because it shifts the focus from what happened to why it happened. And that shift is what brings us closer to understanding. Because once you understand the reasoning behind actions, the sequence itself becomes clearer, more defined, and more capable of being confirmed. And that's where this case is heading now, toward that point where the sequence is no longer uncertain, but structured, where each detail fits within a larger narrative that explains how everything unfolded. And that narrative, once fully understood, will not just answer the question of what happened to Nancy Guthrie, it will explain how it happened, why it happened the way it did, and what it means for everything that comes next. And that's what makes this moment so important, because it represents the beginning of that understanding. The point where silence is replaced by information, where uncertainty begins to give way to clarity, and where the case starts to move in a direction that feels more focused, more precise, and more capable of reaching a conclusion. And as we continue to follow this development, to examine each detail and how it connects to the next, we move closer to that moment where everything finally aligns, where the story is complete, and where the answers we've been searching for are finally within reach. And once those words begin to settle, once the initial impact of Savannah breaking her silence starts to give way to analysis, something deeper begins to emerge, something that goes beyond the surface of what was said and moves into how it fits. Because in a case like this, no statement exists on its own. Every word has a position, every detail has a place within the larger structure, and where it lands determines what it means. And that's exactly what investigators begin to focus on next, not just the content, but the placement. Because when you take what Savannah revealed and begin to map it against the timeline that has already been established, something starts to happen. Certain moments begin to align in a way they didn't before. Sheeted gaps that once felt disconnected start to close. And those closures are not random. They suggest that what was missing wasn't information, but perspective. And that's what this has introduced, a perspective that allows previously unclear moments to take on meaning. And that meaning is what drives the case forward. Because once a detail is understood within its proper context, it becomes part of a sequence. And sequences are what create narratives, not assumptions, not isolated observations, but connected events that follow a pattern, and that pattern is what investigators rely on because it reveals consistency. And consistency is what turns a possibility into something that can be tested, examined, and ultimately confirmed. And that's what is beginning to take shape now, a pattern that is being reinforced by what Savannah has revealed. Tonia, not in a way that answers everything immediately, but in a way that provides direction, a path that can be followed more precisely than before. And as that path becomes clearer, as each step is examined in relation to the next, something else becomes noticeable. The way behavior begins to align with that structure, because behavior is never random. It reflects thought, it reflects reaction, it reflects decisions made under specific conditions, and when those behaviors begin to match the sequence that is being built, it strengthens the framework. It suggests that what is being observed is not coincidence, but connection. And that connection is what gives this moment its weight, because it means that what Savannah has said is not just adding information, it is reinforcing a structure that is already forming. And that reinforcement is what brings clarity, because once multiple elements begin to point in the same direction, once they align across different parts of the case, the likelihood of that direction being accurate increases. And that's where the case begins to shift from uncertainty to probability, from asking what could have happened to understanding what most likely did happen. And that shift is what defines a turning point. Because it changes the way the entire case is approached, it moves the focus from broad possibilities to specific sequences. And that specificity is what allows investigators to move forward with purpose, to test the strongest connections, to follow the most consistent patterns, and to build a narrative that holds together under scrutiny. And that's what we are beginning to see now. The early stages of that narrative forming, shaped by this new information and the connections it creates, and as that narrative develops, as each piece finds its place within the larger sequence, something else becomes clear: the role of each individual within that structure. Because once the sequence is defined, once the timeline is aligned and the behaviors match, it becomes easier to see where people fit within that framework. Not as conclusions, but as positions, points within the sequence that can be analyzed and understood in relation to everything else. And that's where the focus begins to narrow, not in a way that excludes possibilities, but in a way that prioritizes them, that highlights the areas where the strongest connections exist. And that prioritization is what brings the case closer to resolution. And if because it directs attention where it matters most, it ensures that the investigation is guided by evidence that aligns consistently rather than by speculation that shifts with each new detail. And that consistency is what gives the case its direction. Because once you know what holds together, once you know what remains intact under scrutiny, you can build from that. You can expand the sequence, test it further, and refine it until it either confirms itself or reveals where adjustments need to be made. And that process is what we are witnessing now, the refinement of a sequence that is becoming clearer with each passing moment. And as that refinement continues, as each detail is examined more closely and each connection is tested against what is known, the picture becomes sharper, more defined, until eventually it reaches a point where it can no longer be dismissed as coincidence, where it stands as a structure that explains how everything fits together. And that's the moment everyone is waiting for, the moment where the case transitions from possibility to understanding, where the narrative that has been forming becomes something that can be clearly seen and fully followed. And that moment is getting closer, because with each new detail, with each connection that aligns, the sequence becomes stronger, more resilient, and more capable of holding under the weight of scrutiny. And that resilience is what will ultimately determine the outcome. Because once a sequence holds, once it remains consistent no matter how it is tested, it becomes the foundation for everything that comes next. The point from which conclusions can be drawn and actions can be taken. And that's where this case is heading now, toward that foundation, guided by this moment where silence was broken and something new was introduced into the structure, something that is now being examined from every angle, tested against every detail, and placed within the sequence that is slowly but steadily coming into focus. And as we continue to follow this, as we continue to connect the pieces and build the narrative, we move closer to the moment where everything finally aligns, where the story is complete and where the answers we've been searching for are no longer out of reach, but fully visible, fully understood, and impossible to ignore. And when everything begins to settle, when the weight of what Savannah revealed is no longer just being processed but fully understood within the structure of the case, something becomes clear in a way it never has before. Not as a sudden revelation, but as a realization that has been building quietly through every detail, every connection, every moment that didn't quite make sense until now. Because what once felt like separate pieces are no longer separate. They are connected, they are aligned, and they form a sequence that can be followed without breaking. And that is what changes everything. Because once a sequence holds, once it remains consistent, no matter how closely it is examined, it becomes the foundation for truth, not absolute confirmation, but a direction that is grounded in something stronger than speculation. Was something that can be tested, reinforced, and ultimately understood. And that's where this case is now, at the edge of that understanding, where the silence that once defined so much of what we didn't know has been replaced by something that allows us to see the case differently, to interpret the timeline with greater clarity, and to recognize patterns that were always there, but never fully visible until now. And that recognition is what brings everything into focus. Because once you see how the pieces connect, once you understand how each moment leads into the next, the case stops feeling like a mystery made of fragments and starts feeling like a narrative that can be followed from beginning to end. And that narrative, as it continues to take shape, begins to answer questions that have been lingering from the very start, not all at once. Not in a single moment, but gradually as each part of the sequence reinforces the next, until eventually there is enough to see the full picture in a way that feels complete, in a way that holds together no matter how it is examined. And that is the point every investigation moves toward. The point where the unknown becomes understood, where uncertainty gives way to clarity, and where the story that has been building piece by piece finally reveals itself in full. And that is what Savannah's statement has set into motion. Not a conclusion, but a shift, a movement towards something more defined, more structured, and more capable of leading to answers. Because once the silence is broken, once information begins to flow, where there was once absence, everything else begins to adjust around it. The timeline, the behavior, the connections. And when all of it reshapes itself to accommodate what is now known, and that reshaping is what allows the case to move forward, because it replaces gaps with links. It turns uncertainty into direction, and it provides a path that can be followed with increasing clarity. And as that path continues to unfold, as each new detail is examined and each connection is confirmed, the case moves closer to resolution, closer to the moment where everything aligns fully, and the sequence that has been forming becomes something that can no longer be questioned. Something that stands on its own as the most accurate representation of what happened. And that moment, when it arrives, will not just answer the questions surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. It will redefine how the case is understood entirely, because it will show that the key to everything was not hidden in something distant or complex, but in something much closer. Something that required the right moment to come into focus. And that moment may have just happened. Because now, with Savannah's silence broken and the details beginning to align, the case is no longer standing still. It is moving. It is progressing towards something that feels inevitable. A conclusion built not on assumption, but on connection, on consistency, and on a sequence that holds together from beginning to end. And that is what makes this so significant, because it represents the transition from searching to finding, from questioning to understanding. And that transition is what brings closure, not just to the investigation, but to the story itself. Because once the truth is understood, once the sequence is complete, there is nothing left to piece together, only to acknowledge what has been revealed and to follow where it leads next. And that is the moment we are approaching now, the moment where everything finally comes together, where the case reaches a point of clarity it has never had before, and where the answers we have been searching for are no longer hidden, but fully visible. And if you have followed this case from the beginning, if you have paid attention to every detail, every shift, every moment where something didn't quite align until now, then you already know how important this is. because this is where everything changes. This is where the story moves from uncertainty into understanding. And this is where the truth begins to take its final shape. And if you want to be there when that happens, if you want to follow this case all the way to its conclusion and see how every piece fits together, make sure you stay right here, because this is where we uncover the details that matter. This is where we connect the pieces others overlook, and this is where the truth, no matter how hidden it may seem, is brought into the light. And the next detail, the next breakthrough, the next moment that changes, everything could be closer than we think. So if you don't want to miss it, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay connected, because this case may be reaching its turning point. But the story is not over yet. And when the next piece falls into place, you'll want to see it happen.